Hello friends, it's Juliana Michaels and welcome to my channel. As you may have already noticed, there's a certain something being repeated on some of my Halloween cards this year. I'm not sure why, but I have always loved a holiday wreath, regardless of the holiday. I love making them, and every year I have to control myself from making a new one. Just to give you an idea of what I mean, here's a photo of a Halloween wreath I made a few years ago. So you can only imagine my delight when I saw the Vault Foliage Wreath die set. My brain immediately went into how I could use this as a base to create Halloween wreaths using some of the other Halloween dies from this release. In this video, I'm sharing another wreath option I created. For this card, I've pulled out the Distress Inks, Distress Spritz, and of course I've got a few tips and tricks, or should I say tricks and treats, to share with you. If you're interested in any of the products I'm using in this video, you can find the supply list with links in the description box below. When you shop through those links, you're supporting me, and I appreciate that support so very much. For this card, I'm going to be using some of the new Holtz Sizzix die sets, including Vault Portrait, Vault Wicked, and Vault Foliage Wreath. And these are all part of Tim's recent Sizzix Halloween release. So along with the dies, I'm going to also be using the Life of the Party stamp set for my sentiment, but you could use any stamp set for your sentiment. And the same with the dies. Like, you don't have to use these dies to follow along with the techniques I'm using in this video. You could easily switch it up and use other Halloween dies from your stash. The paper I'm going to be working on is the Distress wood grain paper. So this has like a wood grain pattern embossed into a white cardstock. So that's going to be used for the background of our card. I'm also going to be using some Distress watercolor paper, black cardstock, and black glitter paper to create the embellishments for the card. The mediums I'm going to be working with, I've got a variety of Distress inks in some different colors here. So I have Fossilized Amber, Dusty Concord, Twisted Citron, Black Soot, and Hickory Smoke. And of course you could switch these colors out. I'm also going to be using some of the Distress Spritz. I've got Twisted Citron, Fossilized Amber, and Spice Marmalade. And then I'm also going to be adding in some Gloss Spray Black to do some splatters. And then for stamping with the sentiment, I'll be using the Archival ink, Black Soot. But any kind of black ink will work for stamping the sentiment, so you can choose whatever you like there. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is work on the background, and for that I'm going to take the Dusty Concord Distress ink pad, and I'm just going to rub it over the surface of this paper. Now, it has an embossed texture to it, so if you don't have this particular paper, you could also, if you've got a wood grain type embossing folder, you could also emboss your paper and do this same technique after you've embossed the paper. So I'm just going to rub the ink pad kind of over the surface here, and I'm not pushing down, I'm just rubbing it very lightly over the surface just to hit all those highlighted, raised areas of the design. Okay. And now you're going to dry this, and this is very important. You want this completely dry before we move on to the next step. So you can still see the white background and the contrast of the Dusty Concord that we just added. So we're going to dry that. And it just takes a few seconds, but you just want to make sure you give it a good dry. You could also set it to the side and give it time to dry. You just want to let that ink completely dry before we add the next layer. And now you're going to take a blending brush or blending foam, whatever you prefer, and we're going to take that same Dusty Concord ink, and now we're just going to blend lightly over the background to turn that white part of the card Dusty Concord color. And I'm going to show you here in a second what happens if you don't let that ink dry before you do this step. So as you can see, you get that distinct contrast there between the raised areas and the part that was white before we just added that ink. So now I'm going to show you on a scrap paper, just same process. We're going to rub the ink over the paper here. And we're not going to dry it. I'm just going to go straight in with the ink. And you're going to see that as this dries, the ink is going to be kind of blending in more, and you're not going to get the same contrast that you get with this one. So as that dries, this is actually going to change compared to this one. You can already kind of start seeing it happen. There's just not as much contrast, like it's kind of all starts to trying to turn the same color. So I think it has to do with the ink that you put on there when you rubbed over it. It wasn't dry, so it's still wet, and then you're adding wet on wet, so they blend, which is what Tim always says, where wet on dry will layer. And that's where you're getting here, where this one starts blending in and almost gives you like a kind of a bleeding look to the ink colors as it continues to dry into the paper. So just a slightly different look. So just something I noticed when I was creating the background and playing around with things. So I thought I'd share it. So here's that paper where we did it wet on wet, and this is it completely dried now. And then this is the one where we did the wet ink, dried it, and then added another layer. And you can see, to me, there's a big difference between what this looks like. This one has just a much more of a crisp, cleaned design to the texture, where this one, it's kind of, I don't know, just kind of, it's not nearly as crisp. It just kind of, I don't know, it's like the design bled out. So, all right. All right, so the next thing we're gonna do is we're gonna add some splatters using the Dina Wakley Media Gloss Spray in black. And this is an acrylic spray, so when it dries, if it gets onto a surface, it's gonna be permanent. So that's why I like to work in a splat box with this spray for sure, because if it gets onto your craft mat and stuff, once it dries, it's permanent. It's not gonna come off. So just something to keep in mind, and just wanna give it a good little shake. Make sure the pigments and everything are mixed in there well. And then I'm just going to unscrew the lid and tap to create my splatters. And, you know, you could also, you know, if you wanted to dip a brush in here and use that as well, but you just wanted to make sure you clean that brush off when you're done. So let's kind of rotate the paper a little bit so the splatters are kind of going in different directions. There we are. And then I'm just going to set this to the side to dry. I kind of find that this spray does better if you just let it dry on its own instead of trying to speed up the process. So once it dries, it'll be shiny, hence the name gloss spray. So just going to let that dry for a few seconds here. It dries pretty quickly, and so now that it's dry, I'm going to add some more splatters using some of the new Distress Spritz. And for this, I'm going to use the Twisted Citron, and just want to make sure when you're working with these, like you can see, I had it laying on its side, and you can see all the pearl kind of laying there. You just want to make sure you shake it up well and get all that pearl mixed in with the liquid so that it's ready to use. And then I'm going to do the same thing like I did with the black spray. Just going to tap it across the background here. And now this one, I am going to kind of speed up the drying process with my heat tool. And as this is drying, you can start seeing that shimmer and shine come out from the pearl. that's in these spritzes. And then once that's completely dry, like when you rub your finger over it, nothing will come off on your hand once it's dry. So if it's still wet, it will come off, but once it's dry, it's there to stay. So there is our background. So we're just gonna set that to the side now, and we're gonna start working on the embellishments for the card. So off camera, I did a bit of die cutting using the distressed watercolor cardstock for any of the white paper that you see there, and then just some heavy black cardstock. And then I also did some with some black glitter cardstock. Now this black glitter cardstock is pretty thin, so I cut some of those pieces out of just plain black cardstock, and I'm going to glue those together just to give these a little bit more, just to make these a little bit more sturdy. And then I also am gonna do the same thing with the sentiment. I'll glue these two layers together to give that a little more structure as well. I also left one of the pieces of scrap watercolor paper here that I'm going to add the color to and then do the die cutting, because it'll be a little easier since I'm using these little small stars. So for that, I'm going to start off, I'm going to be doing ink smushing for all of these die cuts, which is just one option of how to add color to paper. There's, you know, you can ink blend it on if you like, if you just want to use a brush and blend the ink onto the paper, you can certainly do that. This just happens to be one of my favorite ways because it gives you a little bit more of a distressed effect. So I'm just gonna dab this and then dry it. Besides the ink blending, you could also use spray stains, or if you wanted to do oxide inks, you could use oxide inks. It's just gonna give you a slightly different look because the inks are different, have different properties, but any of them would work to color the cardstock. Or if you really wanna go super simple, you could just use colored cardstock. So, lots of options. And I think I'm going to get a little more yellow on here, so add a little bit more, more color there. And as I dab in, I'm kind of trying to dab in where I haven't, like where it's like if I dab in once and then I go back in, I'm kind of tilting and holding the paper so that it's not always going back in on the same spot, because then it just keeps blending the color instead of creating the layers. All right, now I'm going to continue with that piece, and now I'm going to add some of the fossilized amber distress spritz. And as you can see, that pearl's kind of laying there on this from me laying this on the side. So just want to give it a good mix in. And we're just going to give this a spritz to the paper, and a little does go a long way as far as adding to the shimmer, which you can already see there with it still wet. So I might just do one more little spritz there, and then you just want to make sure you clean off the nozzle area so that it doesn't clog on you. And then you can either set that to the side to dry, or you can use your heat tool and dry it, whichever you prefer. So there is a look at that finished colored cardstock, and then I'm going to use that to die cut the stars and the moon that we'll be using on the card. All right, so the next thing I'm going to do is we're going to add some color to the word Fright here. And I'm just going to, again, just kind of smush the ink onto my craft mat. And then you can use your fingers if you want, or you can use a pair of tweezers and just kind of dab it in. Get that ink on there. And then I'm going to dry that. And this is just a kitchen trivet to protect my craft mat, which is heat resistant-ish, but not quite enough for my liking. So I just want to protect it and keep it from warping. So I got this little kitchen trivet. All right. And we'll dip back in here, get another layer on. Get that spot we didn't get the first time. And then give it another dry. And then I'm actually gonna clean that up and add a little bit more ink. My mat here. And we'll do another dip in and get it, just add another layer here. There we go. So you can kind of just keep doing that as many times as you like until you're happy with how it looks. And then I'm going to glue this onto this just plain white one here just to make that a little more sturdy. So now we're going to take the two white wreaths and I'm going to ink smush one of them into some hickory smoke ink here. We'll just kind of make sure we don't have any green ink on our tweezers. I'm going to smush that into this ink. And we'll give that a dry. Get a little more of that. I wonder if I think my ink pad needs to be re-inked. Let's see, I'm in a little light there. Here we go. One more. That definitely needs to be re-inked. I'll be doing that shortly. There we go. Right, so I'm just kind of building up some layers here. And if you get a little spot there that maybe you want a little more color on, you can also pick it up and dab it on with your fingers. Now we're going to do the same thing with the black soot. Okay, and you just can kind of keep repeating that until you're happy with how it looks. And you can also just hold it with the tweezers and dry it if you like. That's just another option. And so there's our 3 layers for the wreath, and then we'll just kind of layer those and offset them with each other just to create a really cool wreath there. And then if you want to darken these up a little bit, you can just take like one of the small little blending brushes and just add a little bit of some black soot. Just kind of tap around on it. You want it darker. Or you could leave it like it was. It's kind of up to you. And as I mentioned earlier, with any of these, you know, you could certainly just cut these out of different colors of black cardstock, use distress sprays. You know, there's a variety of options for adding color to your die cuts. Really just a matter of personal preference and, you know, maybe how much time you have. So yeah, options, you have options. So now I'm just gonna glue all these different layers together and then we'll go about assembling the wreath onto the card. And just to add a little more interest to this die cut, I'm gonna add a spritz of the Distress Spritz and Twisted Citron. So just give it a little shimmer and just make sure I get that all mixed in well. And then give it a good spritz. And then, you know, you can either set that to the side to dry or dry it with your heat tool. All right, so I have all of my die cuts ready to go. And then I just used some double-sided foam adhesive strips. This is from scrapbook.com. This is a 1 millimeter thickness and a 2 millimeter thickness. And they also have 3 millimeter thickness and a bunch of different like strips and rolls and squares and mini squares and circles. And then I just added the strips to the back of the die cuts. And like on this one, I put the 1 millimeter on the ends here that are going to be on top of the wreath. And then I put the thicker on the center because I want them to kind of hold that center part up. And if you do the 1 millimeter, it won't be the same level. So that just kind of helps keep everything at level. And then, yeah, and then I'll just adhere all these to the wreath. And then I'll use some liquid adhesive to adhere the stars onto the wreath. So here is a look at the finished card. And you can see that touch of shimmer that was added with the Distress Spritz sprays. And I kind of like the contrast a little bit with the black glitter paper. I'm really fingers crossed that we'll be getting a black soot Distress Spritz at some point, because I think I would probably have used that instead of the glitter paper. And yeah, and then the only other thing I did here is the sentiment strip, I added a little bit of black soot distress ink around the outside edge of it to just help it stand out a little bit more. And then I also added a little bit of black soot distress ink around the edges of the background paper just to kind of frame it in. And then I matted everything onto a piece of black cardstock. So I hope you enjoyed seeing the process on how this frightfully fun Halloween card came together. Thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you can join me on a more regular basis. Hit the like if you enjoyed this video, and if you want to join me on my other social media platforms, you can find the links to those in the description box below. Also, feel free to leave me a comment if you have any questions or if there's something you'd love to share with me and our community. I'll see you in the comments below and in the next video. Until next time, stay crafty, my friend.